so wonderful to have an opportunity to connect with one another. But if you could find your seats, we will get started this morning. I'm Laurie Schreiner. I chair the Department of Higher Education here at Azusa Pacific University, and we are delighted to have you here this morning. This is always such a treat for us. Our Critical Issues seminar that we do each year at this time, where we invite a thought leader in higher education to share his or her journey with us and to talk with us about the critical issues that are facing higher education. So we are so delighted to have Sandy Astin with us this morning. And I've asked Chris Collins, one of our doctoral faculty, to introduce Dr. Astin.
Thank you for coming this morning. This is Dr. Alexander, or Sandy Astin, and he doesn't need any introduction. You have his book, you've read his work in your classes, you've cited his work. If you attended the dissertation presentations last night, you can count how many times you saw involvement theory or IEO on a slide as someone was presenting their methodology. But we want to give him a very, very warm welcome and give a tribute to the ways in which he's used his expertise, his knowledge, and his positions to break through walls and barriers in higher education, to study things that have been understudied, to point out things that need to be studied more, that need to gain more attention. His expertise just isn't in his research methods and his statistics, but in making his research available to the public. When he worked on the Spirituality in Higher Education project, they had a whole PR team designing flyers. They had a whole board of experts trying to rally around how do we make this information more accessible to larger groups to make an influence in higher ed. And his most recent project is right in front of many of you, the book, Are You Smart Enough? Now, I'm married to a woman who is the Dean of Enrollment Management at an institution that accepts about 30% of their applicants and enrolls even fewer. And this book is tough on people in those positions. And I'm trying to get her whole staff to read it, but we're still working on it. And so as you listen to him present this morning and ask questions and engage with him, I hope that you won't take what's in front of you lightly and think about what's in your sphere of influence, because he's worked on people in his sphere of influence for decades. And one of the best things we can take away is how can we do the same thing with people around us. Please welcome Dr. Sandy Astin.
Testing. Oh, wow. There's an explosion there. Chris wanted me to talk about some of the issues addressed in this book, Are You Smart Enough, today, and that's what I plan to do, but I'm going to leave a fair amount of time at the end for Q&A, which is really the part of gatherings like this that I enjoy the most myself. So, but since it's not fair to assume that everybody has read and understood everything in the book, my talk will review some of these things and maybe put them in a little different context and add a few thoughts that I've had since I wrote the book. And then we can move on to a Q&A, and we've got a lot of time for it. So please, if you want to ask questions, have them ready, and I can sit here as long as there are questions coming. So let's look forward to that. As we all know, that if you look around the world of higher education, our system in this country is the model. Everybody in every country looks to us as a model system. And as a matter of fact, in a recent poll, there were they named the top 30 universities in the world, and we're talking about 150 countries now. The top 30 universities, 21 were American, and 7 of the top 10 were American. American scientists, most of whom are working in universities, have won more than a third of all the Nobel Prizes ever given out over all the years. And of the 10 universities that have the most Nobel Prize winners on their faculty, 8 of them are in the US. In addition to the obvious outstanding reputation that our system enjoys, our 4,000 plus colleges and universities that make up the system are home to a formidable array of facilities and resources: libraries, laboratories, classrooms, student unions, beautiful campuses, and highly trained staff and faculty covering all of the world's major fields of knowledge. But after devoting my long, and it's been long, professional career to the study of this system, I've reluctantly come to the conclusion that the quality of the system should not and cannot be judged simply on the basis of our reputation and our resources. On the contrary, the quality of any higher education institution ultimately has to be judged in terms of its performance, the extent to which it's able to use its resources to carry out its mission and serve the society that supports it. So my talk this morning will argue that over the years, our system has come to embrace a set of policies and values and practices that severely limit its capacity to deploy these remarkable resources for the betterment of society. Much of what I'm going to say will be based on, of course, on the book, Are You Smart Enough? But I'll add a few things as well. It comes as no surprise that colleges and universities value the intellect, or what I have chosen to call smartness. You may prefer intelligence, brilliance, creativity, whatever, but for, for simplicity, I'll just talk about smartness. After all, you got to be pretty smart to get into a good college, to earn good grades, to enroll in and complete a doctoral program, right? Or to win a Nobel Prize. Every college or university obviously seeks to enroll the smartest students it can attract and hire the smartest professors it can find. However, what may not be so obvious, the problem that motivated me to write the book in the first place, is that too many of our 1.5 million faculty members who staff these institutions have come to value merely being smart rather than developing smartness, which is, after all, what education is about. Developing students' talents is the principal mission of any educational institution, to help them learn, grow, and develop into competent and responsible citizens, parents, employees, and professionals. Most colleges and universities are committed, at least in word, if not in deed, to promoting educational equity. The social and economic inequities in our K-12 system are well known, with a rapidly expanding system of expensive private schools and the striking contrast between urban and suburban public schools. Our higher education system, on the other hand, is generally regarded, at least by people in other countries, as far more equitable, given that each of the 50 states has committed itself to providing low-cost higher education opportunities for almost any high school graduate. Nevertheless, these open access state systems mask an important truth about our post-secondary education. The opportunities available to students with differing levels of academic preparation are far from equivalent. Our system invests the most in those students with the highest levels of academic preparation and the least in those with the poorest preparation. As long as post-secondary opportunities remain so unequal for students with differing levels of preparation, higher education will continue to be handicapped in its efforts to contribute to a more just and equitable society. The unequal educational treatment of college students stems largely from our preoccupation with smartness. And what I'm going to try to convince you of today, hopefully, is that this preoccupation with smartness, which infects all of our institutions and most of us, is something that we're not consciously aware of, but which affects almost everything we do in academia. So by designing our system to favor the smartest students, what we're really doing is differentially rewarding people who have the highest test scores and the highest grades. The most prestigious colleges limit their admissions to such students, which means that all the other students have to attend colleges with fewer resources and staffed by faculty members who, according to national surveys, would rather be teaching smarter students. And this is a really serious problem. If you look at some of the reports on faculty values and attitudes that are put out by the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, you can see some of that rather depressing tendency. Every fall, faculty members in selective colleges and universities watch closely to see how well their new freshmen have scored on admissions tests. The smarter the students, as reflected in their average test scores, the better. And once students enroll, most professors rely on course grades to assess progress. Grades may be useful in identifying smart students for purposes of awarding honors, let's say, but they don't tell us much about what students are actually learning. Given that learning is the main business of any college or university, this lack of information on what's being learned is regrettable, since it deprives students and their teachers of valuable feedback that can improve the learning process for students at all levels of preparation. In short, my faculty colleagues seem content with assessment methods that are of little use in measuring what students are learning, as long as these methods allow them to rate and rank students in terms of their relative smartness. Now that sounds like an extreme position, but I really believe it, and I've been hanging around academia long enough to see that we seem to have accepted test scores and grades as the most important data about our students. And we collect it every year. Assessment in the public schools falls prey to the same problems because they look to us to sort of set the course. If we are so fond of standardized tests, surely then K-12 has to be fond of them, and so on. Instead of revealing to teachers what each student is learning, standardized tests at the K-12 level are used merely to compare schools, to identify the best and the worst schools. To be of any use in improving teaching and learning, tests should be repeated with the same students over time to measure growth and improvement. And the tests would have to be scored differently rather than merely comparing students with each other. You scored better than 40% of the students. That's the information that's fed back to the student. Test scores would also have to reflect what students actually know, what their specific strengths and weaknesses are. The fact that college and university admissions offices rely so heavily on norm reference tests gives permission, in effect, to the lower schools to do the same. This preoccupation with being smart has affected many of the faculty's most important functions to the point where it's compromised our most basic missions of educating our students and serving the society that supports us. What are some of the specific things in higher education that this preoccupation with smartness has affected? I prepared some slides for today, with a list of all of these things that it's affected, and I decided that would just be a distraction. So if you'll bear with me, I'll challenge your powers of visual imagery to I've already mentioned the pursuit of equity. When SATs and ACTs are used to screen and select, they put poor students, first-generation students, and underrepresented students of color at a competitive disadvantage. I mean, we don't want to face up to that. We're using a method of assessing the quality of our students when they're admitted, which screws over a large number of students because they, as a group, tend not to perform as well on these tests. Now, if colleges were equivalent in the opportunities they offered, this wouldn't be a problem, but they're far from equivalent. If you take public higher education as an example, the expenditures per student per full-time student on instruction, because our expenditures are categorized in a lot of different ways. Just the expenditures on instruction in the four-year colleges, public colleges in our country, they spend twice as much per student as the community colleges do. This is per full-time student. And considering that our public colleges educate 80% of our undergraduates, this is hardly an equitable situation. But notice that the technology that's used to support this kind of an arrangement is the standardized test score and the GPA. If you compare just the flagship universities in our public system, that ratio would be well over 3-to-1. There's also the issue of residential facilities. Most of the people going to flagship universities, freshmen, live in dormitories. In the Cal State or state university systems, it's maybe 50 to 60%. In the community colleges, it's near zero. And all the research on the residential experience has showed clearly that it's an advantage for young people to be able to live on the campus. Let's now turn to standardized testing. We test because we want to identify the smartest students, and we go along with the testing company's long-standing practice of normative scoring. Norm scores, which are standard scores and percentiles, don't reveal much of anything about what a student knows or what that student's particular strengths and weaknesses are. Instead, they merely order students from the smartest to the least smart. But then that's mainly what institutions are after. Schools at the K-12 level have also come to rely heavily on standardized tests, in part because we at the higher level are such heavy users. But consider this. If you were a student in a K-12 school and you took a standardized test, the odds are that you're going to be told that you're only average or below average. That's the information you'll get back. Now, if you get that kind of message year after year after year, starting at the second or third grade, how's that going to motivate you to want more education when you finish K-12, or even to finish K-12? The kinds of messages that average or below average scores send is, you're not college material, you're dumb, you're lazy, you're a loser. Since most school students receive these messages, it's no wonder so many drop out and so many have no interest in post-secondary education. An equally serious limitation of standardized tests is their narrowness of content. I always like to sort of burlesque this whole thing. How many times when you get out in the real world of work, does your boss come to you and say, Sandy, I've got a problem, and there are 4 possible answers to the problem. I'd like you to, here are the 4 possible, and I'd like you to pick the right answer, and you've got a minute to do it. If you consult college mission statements to find out what student outcomes are most valued by institutions, you won't find anything that's very much related to what's in a standardized test. Instead, you're going to find qualities like leadership skills, social responsibility, creativity, and citizenship, none of which has much relevance to what standardized tests measure. So our colleges are on record as claiming to be pursuing objectives that are irrelevant to a standardized test. In other words, to equate student smartness with standardized tests like the SAT or the ACT greatly oversimplifies the remarkable diversity of human talent. Now let's turn to admissions. We faculty seek to admit only the smartest student because it reflects well on us. Let's admit it. If our students are so smart, surely we must be smart. It's an ego thing to some extent. This heavy reliance on SATs and ACTs has helped to spawn an annual admissions madness, where affluent students and their parents pull out all the stops to get the student admitted to the most selective institutions. And I've just been through that with 2 granddaughters. And it's madness. It's absolute madness. Institutional competition for smart students is intimately tied in to the pecking order of colleges and universities that the U.S. News and World Report attempts to document every year in what has proved to be its most profitable enterprise, actually. And I have to tell you, I've been a trustee of several colleges over the years, and those trustees, I lecture them about this, but I don't get anywhere, is that they just hang on every new set of rankings that comes out in the U.S. News reports. It's absurd. But it feeds our egos, and I think that's what it's really about. The more exclusive and the more elite our institution is, the better. Some of our less elite universities have actually resorted to purchasing smart students by sponsoring national merit scholarships just to elevate their prestige and enhance their U.S. News rankings. If merit finalists name a sponsoring college as their first choice, their chances of winning a merit scholarship can be substantially enhanced from about 1 in 8 if they're a merit finalist to about 1 in 2 or 100%. In some cases, it's a 100% increase. Virtually none of our most elite colleges engage in this practice. However, since they can get their very smart students for free. In the fall of 2013, the Southeastern Athletic Conference, the SEC, a consortium of 14 universities known mainly for their formidable football teams, enrolled more merit scholars, 1,046, even than the 8 Ivy League colleges did, 1,014. Pretty close, but still. However, more than 80% of the scholars enrolling in the SEC universities were sponsored, while none of the scholars enrolling at Ivy League institutions was sponsored. And if you look at it, at our region, our Pac-12 in California and Arizona and Oregon and Washington, the most elite universities in that group of 12 don't sponsor any merit scholars. Same thing. Let's look at the faculty reward system. We've struggled for decades with the problem of research versus teaching. This conflict is especially severe in the major research universities, but the publish-or-perish mandate affects faculty in many smaller universities and liberal arts colleges as well. I won't ask if it operates here, but I bet that it does. Once again, it's the faculty's preoccupation with smartness that fuels this imbalance. You say, why would that be? Most faculty value research because they believe that writing and publishing requires a good deal of smartness. There's little agreement, however, on what it takes to be a good classroom teacher and mentor. Moreover, whereas there's a clearly established performance standard for demonstrating your smartness through research and scholarship, that is the publication, there's no agreed upon way to know for sure how good a colleague is at teaching and advising. So we go for the performance measure that is accessible and that reflects smartness. I really think that's what it's all about. Why shouldn't the best teacher be the most prestigious faculty member? Why not? Now, I'm talking about generalizations, and I know that probably in some universities, these things are not as severe as I make them, but in terms of the system at large, they're alive and well. The relative importance assigned to research versus teaching is revealed in the terminology that we use. Practically all of us at one time or another have complained about our teaching load. And sometimes we hire prestigious faculty members with the perk that you'll have a low teaching load. But when it comes to research, have you ever heard a professor say, you know, my research load is really too much. I have to get a reduction in my research load. The relative importance assigned to research versus teaching is basically makes teaching a burden, at least for some faculty members. Here in a nutshell is the crux of the research versus teaching dilemma, and I've picked out a quote from the book here because I'm fond of the quote, I guess. College professors attach great importance to research and scholarship because they have created a culture that venerates smartness, but they happen to be employed in institutions where their main responsibility is to educate students. That's what the research versus teaching thing is all about. Their reverence for smartness also influences how they view different disciplines. Why do the hard sciences have so much status and prestige on university campuses? And why are fields like nursing, social work, and education often looked down upon? Because professors in the hard sciences are regarded as very smart, whereas professors of nursing, social work, and education are suspected of being not so smart. I hate to admit all this stuff, but I think that's the truth. Perhaps the most telling evidence of how academics' obsession with smartness affects their relations with students comes from these national surveys I mentioned. Fully half of faculty are not satisfied with the quality of their students, and more than half report that working with underrepresented students is a source of stress. I don't quite follow that, but that's what they say. Clearly, in a culture that venerates smartness, working with less than the smartest students is not a valued activity. So it even affects this preoccupation with smartness. It even affects how we view our work. And if we're stuck with working with underprepared students, we don't value that, and our colleagues don't value that as much. Now let's turn to grading. Our obsession with smartness also helps to perpetuate the dubious practice of course grading. If faculty members really wanted to assess the effectiveness of their pedagogy and document what students are actually learning, they could hardly pick a worse assessment method than course grades. I should bring you along with me for other talks that I give. A student who already knows most of the course material before enrolling in a course, we used to call those SNAP courses or gut courses or whatever, but can get an A without having to learn much, without even going to class. But among students who begin the course with little knowledge of the material, a B might mean that they've learned a lot. To know what individual students are actually learning then, faculty need to employ metrics that reflect what the students already know, and use these measures longitudinally in order to measure growth or change, practices that very few college teachers employ. And for that matter, hardly employ at the K-12 level either. So why do we still use grades? Because they can be useful in differentiating students in terms of their relative smartness. Students with the best grades are awarded honors, and those with the poorest grades are placed on probation or dismissed. Moreover, graduate and professional schools and employers like to use grades because they believe grades can help them identify the smartest applicants. But grades tell us almost nothing about learning. And people have, when I've talked about this stuff, have gotten on my case and said, okay, if grades are so awful, what would you put in their place? And I thought a lot about this and talked to a lot of people, and I've become gradually convinced that what we've come to call the narrative evaluation is a very powerful kind of assessment. It doesn't come with numbers. You can't necessarily identify the smartest students, but it's a fantastically rich source of potential feedback to both the student and the teacher, because you're forced by virtue of the task, namely to write a little essay about what's going on with the student academically, and you can add non-academic stuff too. There's no limits on what you can put in a narrative evaluation. All of the evidence on this indicates that it's a very powerful and effective assessment method. And unfortunately, it has been resisted by most institutions, and they stick with the grade because the grade is easier. You don't really have to know anything about the student to give them a grade. So they're easier to, grading is a lot easier. Narrative evaluations have tremendous potential to enhance the learning process. Students are given specific feedback about subject areas where they need to do more work, or about specific learning skills such as writing, which is, as you guys know, the #1 problem that they may need to strengthen. Moreover, the very act of preparing the narratives helps the professor and the graduate teaching assistant to enhance their understanding of possible adjustments that might strengthen their pedagogical approach. Besides inertia, there are several reasons why the faculties of most colleges have so far shown little interest in replacing traditional letter grading with narrative evaluations. The extra work involved is one obvious problem, not only in writing the evaluation, but also in getting to know the student well enough to write it. This latter problem is especially relevant for faculty who teach in large lecture sessions, where it's possible for students to remain anonymous throughout the whole academic term. One of my granddaughters, who's been at UCLA, just graduated this June, had several courses where the entire term the teacher never knew their name. In fact, the quality of the narrative evaluation is likely to be significantly improved if the professor and the graduate teaching assistant were first to discuss each individual student's progress. These discussions could well enhance the ability of the professor and the graduate student to provide useful advice and guidance to the student. There are other reasons to why they don't use narrative evaluations. The employers and the graduate schools don't like them because they don't come with numbers where they can rate and rank the smartness of their applicants. But if they want to do that, they always have the GRE and the LSAT and the GMAT and the MCAT and all these tests. So that if that's what they want, then they can use those tests rather than corrupt our method of assessing students. The potential power of narrative evaluations, in other words, to enhance the teaching learning process and to diversify the criteria used to evaluate student learning and growth, would appear to far outweigh the extra work of preparing the evaluations and the inconvenience of not having a simple numerical indicator to judge smartness. Alternatives to traditional testing practices are, I think, readily available, even more easily than narrative evaluations, but we don't use them for some obvious reasons. What I recommended in the book was a pretty radical change in the way that we use standardized tests. I mean, I'd prefer that we don't use them at all, but if we feel that we need to use them, we should cease using norm-referenced scoring. and encourage teachers and administrators in the lower schools to do the same, to basically have a revolt against the testing companies and not accept any more normative scoring. We don't have to eliminate tests to do this. We just have to change the way they're scored. And I'm suggesting that we should replace these norm scores with raw scores. Very simple. The number or percentage of questions answered correctly. With raw scores, the built-in competitiveness of norm scores is alleviated, since each student competes with herself. I'm going to work hard to see how much better I can do next time. Can I answer more questions correctly? I mean, why not? In fact, it should be easier so that they don't have to compute percentile scores or standard scores, which are meaningless. You know, we talk about SAT score of 600. It's meaningless. It only tells you where that student stands in relation to other students who took the test. And in the case of 600, it's approximately 1 standard deviation above the mean. What is that? That's really useful information. Perhaps the main advantage of raw scores over norm scores is that it makes it, this is the researcher in me talking here, it makes it possible to assess growth and learning over time. You answered 15 more questions correctly this time, or this time you answered 70% correct rather than only 60%. In this way, students are being provided with concrete evidence of their learning. Being able to measure change or improvement over time also better enables schools and colleges to assess the effectiveness of their educational programs. Colleges that insist on continuing to use standardized tests to identify their smartest applicants can still pick those with the highest raw scores if they want to. The point is simply this: if the consumers of standardized tests, the schools and the colleges, insist that norm scores be replaced by raw scores, the testing agencies will grudgingly have to do it. Replacing norm scores with raw scores suggests an entirely new use for testing. Instead of using tests merely to make invidious comparisons to sort out the smart from the not so smart, why not start using them instead to strengthen the educational process? With raw scores, it becomes possible to assess changes over time so that each student's growth and development can be tracked. In this way, we college teachers have a way of determining whether and how much our students are learning and whether their basic skills are improving. Now, my main qualification on this is that I would hate to see us continue to limit our assessments to the content that's covered by these tests. So even with raw scores, I wouldn't want to see that become the only or the primary means of assessing learning, because there's so many other critically important student qualities that we need to be assessing. And if we don't have standardized tests with which to do this, we can certainly use narrative evaluations. I'd like to wrap up the formal presentation here by returning to the central theme of the book, the fact that college faculties need to focus more on cultivating and developing smartness than on merely identifying and celebrating it. Regularly having access to information concerning how their students are changing and developing over time should help to shift the attention of college faculties more in the direction of the learning process. The same would be true of narrative evaluations, which in contrast to grades, necessarily deal with how much progress students are making in their studies. If professors could manage to make this shift in attention from traditional grading to monitoring each student's growth and improvement over time, some of the stigma associated with teaching average or underprepared students might well dissipate. The job of the educator, after all, is to add to the student's development, and in many respects, it's at least as important for average and underprepared students to show growth as it is for the best prepared students. I should probably modify that. It's more important. That's my sense about it. When we look at American higher education as a whole, continuing to focus so much attention on merely being smart and identifying the smartest students is a losing proposition. Such a focus not only leaves the average and below average students out in the cold, but also distracts our educational institutions from concentrating on their principal mission, which is to develop student smartness. And by continuing to define smartness in terms of such narrowly conceived measures as the SAT or the ACT, we ignore the great diversity of human talents, especially those affective talents like leadership, empathy, tolerance, self-understanding, civic-mindedness, interpersonal skills, and the like that are so necessary to an effectively functioning society and the world. Finally, by continuing to rely on normative measures simply because they simplify the task of identifying the smartest students, we artificially ration the amount of excellence that's possible in our system and continue to send negative and discouraging messages to most of the students who take these tests. I think the initial challenge for faculty at this point is not so much to change our beliefs about smartness, but simply to become more conscious of these beliefs and the role they play in our professional lives. In particular, it'd be useful for faculties to begin a serious discussion of two closely related questions. First, if strengthening the education of students at all levels of preparation is so vital to the future welfare of our society and our country, why should the faculty culture shun the less well-prepared student and not assign greater priority to their education? And second, why has faculty culture come to revere merely being smart rather than committing itself more fully to the challenge of developing smartness in its students? Since intellectual and personal growth and development is what excellent teaching and excellent education are all about, this discussion will almost certainly serve our nation and our colleges and universities well as they strive to meet the challenges of educating students at all levels of preparation. Thanks very much.
You've given us a lot to think about. You've challenged us. I think this is exactly the right time and place to have this challenge. I think as a university, we recognize the strengths our students bring in and the contribution they make to the learning environment, and it is our responsibility to take those gifts and nurture them and develop them. So thank you so much for reminding us of that mission. What we want to do now is to give you an opportunity to ask Sandy some questions until he tells us he's done. I don't see really long cords on this, but I will try to come to you, or you can come to me or to Chris. So we each have microphones because I think it's important for the rest of the audience to hear your question as well as Sandy's answer. So, questions. All right, Jennifer, come up here. This is as far as my cord goes.
Dr. Astin, thank you for being here today. Thank you also for your work. I was headed yesterday evening, and I've cited you hundreds of times, and especially your most recent work. I cited and quoted you many times. And so my questions, I do have two. I would love it if you would comment on any private selective institutions that have a serious commitment to your knowledge in supporting high-risk students to success. And perhaps for those of us who might work in those contexts, ideas about how we might do that effectively. That's a sub-question. And then the next question, I would love to hear about your recommendations for future research along these lines, your recommendations for future research.
So if our students wanted to do research following up on what you have shared, and then I think she also asked if you knew of any of the selective institutions that actually were making the kind of commitment that you're suggesting to students who might be at higher risk.
Well, the basic problem is that we pay a lot of lip service to equity. Every college has a standard line that it delivers about this, and we care about equality of opportunity, we care about equity, and so we get involved in a struggle between our favorite methods of assessment and our desire to educate a broader segment of the population. And we basically can't have it both ways. Because and the more elite we become as an institution, the harder this is. And as it turns out, the most elite institutions are able to cherry pick their underrepresented students because those institutions are so sought after. So a lot of underrepresented students or poor students or first generation students want to go to an elite institution. And so they have a surplus of applicants, and within that pool, they can usually find enough well-prepared students. It's the next level of institutions that have the biggest struggle with this, because the most elite have cherry-picked the underrepresented students with the best test scores and grades. And what's left, if they tried to fill their quotas of underrepresented students, would force them to compromise their quest for eliteness too much. And that's the practical problem that's facing the sort of second tier of selective institutions. And it's a real struggle. And the problem is that they're working at cross purposes. As long as they want to define their eliteness in terms of students' test scores, they're stuck. And so they have to do, affirmative action and everything. And in my judgment, affirmative action is a Band-Aid on a festering problem in our society. When Proposition 209 was being debated in California, I got involved in some big debates with the authors of Prop 209. And I basically, my position was, and they couldn't actually answer my challenge. My position was, okay, I'm a big supporter of affirmative action, and I'll make a deal with you. You claim it's reverse discrimination and so forth. I'll make a deal with you. I will pledge, and I'll get my liberal friends together and make a pledge to phase out affirmative action. If you get your conservative friends together and make a pledge to deal with the problems in our cities that make affirmative action necessary in the first place, And, and they didn't like that at all. They didn't. Because see, these structural problems that we allow to reproduce themselves generation after generation, and it's not limited to inner cities, but it certainly is very obvious in certain neighborhoods and inner cities where the schools are marginal, where where it's not safe, people don't feel safe, where the job opportunities are extremely limited, and so forth, and a lot of unemployment. Where as long as we kind of just ignore those problems and allow them to reproduce themselves, we're going to be having to do affirmative action and other forms of patchwork approach to a fundamental problem, which is we're not talk about equity. We're not structuring our society in such a way to make it more equitable for young people growing up. That's sort of what I see as the issue. So I don't know how I got on this subject, but it's something I was telling Chris as we were going here about this, that I think those are the things that our society needs to start addressing. And it's going to cost money, and I'm sorry, that's the nature of reality. You know, if you're going to change stuff, you're going to have to invest in it. But the payoff in terms of benefiting the society will be huge. You know, if all kids can be born and raised in communities where they feel safe, where they get good education and so forth, and where they have job opportunities and so forth, and that just takes money, and we can do it. But by focusing on that, I think we can eventually make some progress. I don't know what universities can do about it, but they can, you know, do research anyway. And
so if you think about that research,
yeah,
what would you recommend of the research that our students could perhaps consider?
First of all, the folks who are interested in questions of equity and diversity and so forth, I would love to see more of these folks start diverting their attention on these structural problems. You know, fixing our communities, helping people live in a more decent way, where they're not in fear, where they have job opportunities, where they have good schools, and we can do that, but it's going to take some attention. But I would love to see more people who are interested in the problems of underrepresented groups and so forth focus their attention on the underlying structural problems, which as long as we allow them to persist, we're not going to fix things in this society. I don't think. The other thing is that I would like to see more higher education researchers look at the system of higher education rather than an individual institution, but to begin to look at the larger system and how all the parts fit together. Because it's only when you look at the system that way that you can begin to see these inequities. And you realize, hey, yeah, why do we have in California, why does our legislature and our people in the state endorse a system which favors so obviously a small segment, 12.5% in the University of California, over everybody else? What's the state interest in that? Particularly when the bottom 2/3 of the high school graduates end up either not going to college or going to a community college and dropping out. And that's the modal situation for the bottom 2/3 of the high school graduates. That's 2/3 of our population. And what's the state interest in perpetuating that? You know, it'd be interesting to interview some legislators and some state policymakers and some even some professors. You know? So what's the rationale for that? Why do we do that?
All right. Other question? We'll go over here first, and I'll come back here.
I have two quick questions. Do you believe the hunger for smartness is a byproduct of faculty culture or admissions over-reliance on standardized tests, or is it a combination of both?
What was the second one?
Admissions over-reliance on standardized testing. And what questions do we need to ask as higher ed leaders to address the underlying culture of exclusion in higher education?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that college faculty have grown up and been educated under conditions which put a disproportionate emphasis on intellectual prowess. And it's highly valued in graduate school. It's highly valued in, and you look in academic disciplines, you know, who are the most famous and revered people in each academic discipline? Not the great teachers, but the great researchers. When my wife and I were hired at UCLA 44 years ago, nobody, and we were coming from non-academic jobs, nobody asked us a single question about whether we had any interest in teaching or competence or anything like that. Nobody cared. And okay, granted, this is a research university and the problems are more obvious there, but these problems, you'd be surprised how many people in liberal arts colleges I've heard complain about the special perks that the people who publish the most get, even in a good liberal arts college. So we continue to revere scholarship and sort of take teaching for granted. Be really interesting to inquire about that too in research, as long as we're talking about research. But you figure, how do you get to be a college professor? Well, first of all, you were probably a good student in school. So you got good grades and you got high test scores. And you went to college and you probably went to a selective college. And you went to graduate school and you went to a selective graduate school. And in the graduate school, there was this tremendous emphasis on smartness. And so we've grown up and eventually been employed in an environment where there's a huge premium put on smartness. And I think that has helped to create this culture that puts smartness over everything else. And I use the term smartness in a very limited way to refer to the kinds of highly specialized abilities that it takes to be a good student. And those are very highly specialized abilities. I've often felt that the people in the academic disciplines, the faculty members, they should all be required to spend some time observing what goes on in the fields of the arts. Because most people who teach in the arts don't suffer from these problems. There's competition. There's competition in the, who was the best painter or the best dancer or something. But the idea is in the arts to see every student as someone that you're committed to helping improve and develop their skills, their craft or whatever. Their assessment methods tend to be narrative. And we could learn a whole lot by watching. I was a music major as an undergraduate, and I aspired to be a choral conductor. But for all kinds of reasons, I ended up in psychology. But
You gonna do a solo for us later?
yeah, that's another life. So that's, I tend to use arts analogies. I wrote a book on assessment many years ago, and I had a whole chapter on the piano lesson, and how that's really a metaphor for how we ought to look at assessment, what the teacher does, what the student does, and how a good teacher and a good student and how they operate to help to acquire skill at the piano.
Okay, Jasmine?
Good morning, Dr. Astin. Thank you so much for coming. It's been a pleasure. My name is Jasmine, and I'm a third-year student here at APU. Next month, I'll be starting my first full-time faculty position at the University of Laverne. And what advice do you have for the new generation of faculty to truly live out the call to action you have illustrated in your book?
Well, I think one thing is to become a kind of spokesperson for your point of view, rather than just jumping on the bandwagon and becoming another faculty member who overvalues academic skills. And in admissions, looking for other qualities in the students, and being a spokesperson for that. In faculty meetings, pushing the discussion more in the direction of pedagogy and what are we doing and how do we know we're doing anything useful, and the assessment devices. You'll be perceived as a nuisance. But you got to start, as we say in the field of faith, you got to start bearing witness, Yeah. And why not,
Good morning, Dr. Astin. I recently read an article speaking about the comparison between European education and American education. And I'm just curious as to your reaction to what you would say to this article. The person was making was of the opinion that Europeans were smarter than Americans, okay? And I can't go into all the explanation that they gave, but it's a discussion that's interesting to me because we hear so much about how, Americans are falling behind the rest of the world. We're not as smart as we used to be. We don't perform as well as we used to perform, et cetera. So I'm interested in your reaction to all of that.
Well, first of all, you've got the problem of how come, when I started my talk this morning, I reviewed some of the, ratings results for American universities and Nobel Prize winners. And how, if that's true, then how did we do this? It doesn't compute. If we're not as smart as they are, then how come we have the best universities according to them? These are international ratings. And all these Nobel Prize winners and so forth. That's the first thing to say. How do they reconcile their views about how smart we are? I think it may be that the Europeans who make such a claim are looking at our sort of touchy-feely stuff that we do in academia, all the student affairs stuff, which is much more prevalent in American higher education. And they look at our affirmative action, we're compromising our standards and all this routine. So they may be looking at that stuff. And I don't know. I'm just guessing as to what. I would certainly want to hear what they have to say in defense of that kind of an argument, what their rationale is.
Okay, we keep having more questions here.
Okay, can you provide examples of how we as higher ed professionals resist the current culture of pursuing eliteness while working and living in higher education? Because it's my belief that we support it by participating in it. Each time you talk about the university is a collection of individuals. It's a collection of us. We are the directors, we are the associate directors, we are the people in higher ed. And so how do we kind of live this divided life? I took the GRE to get here, and I require students to take the GRE to accept them at LMU.
Yeah.
So how do we live in both worlds?
Well, a lot of this has to do with whether you want to stand outside the system and snipe at it or work from within. My own inclination has always been to work from within, to get to, I think you can be much more persuasive if you get to know the people, the colleagues, and, start a little revolution from within. That's my inclination. So you can't have it both ways. You can't stand outside and snipe and then complain when they don't do anything. So I think that it's always true that revolutions always involve people working from the inside. Successful revolutions are always, I think, and it's what Bernie was talking about. It's what MLK Jr. talked about is working within the system to change it.
Dr. Astin, thank you for this. And just to give a shout out to folks kind of doing revolutionary work, I think our students have been starting a little revolution. Would you say, when you look at what happened in 2015, yes, an explosion of campus activism, sort of coupled with the ways in which we have been working deliberately over time to incrementally change institutions, I think is emerging in a convergence that's powerful. My question for you is a bit in a different direction, though. A lot of what you assert, it seems to me, is undergirded by what might be hidden or invisible to others in the room. And that is, I think, an epistemology. So I'm thinking about my first year students who are about to start Nature of Inquiry here. And I'm thinking about those who are nearing dissertation and trying to refine how they think about affectively and intellectually their own epistemological positionality. And even to hear challenge from you, myself as a researcher, I'd love to know how you would talk about your own epistemology and how perhaps it's evolved over time.
You can depend on our faculty to ask questions like that.
Well, I have to think about that because I never thought of myself in epistemological terms, so I got to kind of. I generally I want to know everything. You know, it's I'm very greedy when it comes to knowledge. So all of my, you know, I'm known as a number cruncher in the field, but actually, I've done a lot of qualitative work, and I don't think I've ever done anything purely quantitative, because you get information from qualitative inquiry that you don't get from numbers, and so I guess I guess I'm kind of greedy. I want to know everything, and the thing about that is that you don't settle on anything. You know, at least I don't. I never say, well, now I know the answer to this or something, because I know that there's more to learn. And okay, if you gotta act, then you do the best you can with what you know. But you always keep in mind the fact that, you know, there's probably some gaps in my knowledge that I've got to fill in, and maybe I can even get a different perspective than the one that's guiding me now. But I'm not, you know, I mean, this is sort of the story of my life. I've always been very skeptical. I got in trouble many times because of my skepticism, but it was based on the idea that nobody really knows anything, you know. And I remember I had a lot of trouble in Sunday school about this. Just, I hate to admit that in an audience like this, but it's true. But it's because I always say, you know, there's more to know, there's more to learn, and there's other ways of gathering information. And to me, that's very exciting to know that, you know, it'll never be over. You know, we'll always be looking for more answers, and that's great. That I love that. Yeah.
All right, I see a question over here. You got to come to me. Come on.
Thank you, Dr. Astin. So I have a question. You cited, there was a quote earlier that you mentioned that, I don't know if it's a significant majority, but a grand majority of faculty consider underrepresented students and students of color a source of stress. I found that very upsetting because I'm part of that community, and I feel that that's not something that's only reflective of faculty, but I think it's also staff and administrators and institutions. So, and then just now you mentioned there's a lot of individuals doing revolutionary work, I hope, but you mentioned doing the revolution from inside to you know, get inside these institutions to change it. But once we are a part of these institutions, how do we avoid the institution changing us or pushing us out? So how do we challenge institutionalized inequalities that oppress minoritized individuals?
Thank you.
I think one way to avoid getting co-opted by that's a 60s term that you guys probably don't know, but getting co-opted by the university is to find like-minded people. You know, this famous quote from Margaret Mead about this. To find, and there are like-minded people everywhere, and find them and begin to gang up a little bit, and rather than, you know, doing it all on your own, and find like-minded people who want to see things changed. I might add that, and this is in all fairness to faculty, that the source of stress question didn't refer to students of color or underrepresented students or anything like that. It referred to underprepared students, which I think is not as loaded, and probably the faculty would answer if you said underrepresented students, they'd answer differently. But the fact remains that it's the underpreparedness that bugs them, and that is likely to involve a disproportionate number of underrepresented students. So.
We have time for one more question. Does anybody want to ask the last one?
Right here, right here. Come on up. You got to come this direction. And Gary, you can talk to Sandy afterward.
Hello, Dr. Astin. My question really revolves around student leadership and the opportunities we give student leaders. Now, I know from my institution at CSUN, and I'm assuming many of my colleagues, we require students to have a higher GPA, a higher standard of education in order to be in these leadership roles. Now, when we're looking at this book and Smarter, that disenfranchises a large number of our students who may want to be in these leadership roles and can benefit from being in these leadership roles. So I was wondering what your thoughts were to combat that kind of inequity between having students who have the higher grades and the higher kind of opportunity for these student leadership roles.
Were you suggesting that the opportunities to get involved in leadership activities are handicapped by the traditional markers of smartness? Is that what you were suggesting? Yeah. Yeah.
So in choosing student leaders, we use GPA as one of the criteria, and how you would see that.
Well, one thing in deference to our traditional measures of smartness, there are certain skills, academic skills, that are very important and very useful in a wide range of fields and endeavors, and in particular the writing. And I really harp on that a lot. If students have real problems writing, then we need to pay a lot of attention to that and give students all the rope that they need to develop those writing skills, all the help and all the opportunity. Because in a very practical sense, it's a handicap to a person going out into the world not to be able to write, well. And so certainly, in fact, I have a section toward the end of the book about that. So I think that it's important if a person doesn't live up to snuff on the GPA or test score to be considered for a leadership opportunity, that it would behoove you to sort of dig into that a little bit and say, what is it that prevents that? What particular? That's the trouble with the GPA. You can't, you don't know anything from the GPA. It doesn't tell you anything. But, you know, a lower GPA might signify problems with writing, might signify problems with, you know, critical thinking. Who knows, you know, but to dig into that. Give students an also to turn it around and assess how relevant is this screening that we're doing to the leadership opportunity. Is it really that important? Maybe we could relax the GPA requirements a little bit, you know, and find other ways to select the students. So a lot of this has to do with sort of tailor-making your selection procedure to the real demands of the work involved. And if something's lacking in a student, but that student really wants to have that opportunity, then to help provide them with whatever assistance they need to come up to snuff.
Well, thank you very much for your time this morning. Let's give him a round of applause. This has been such a gift to have him with us, and he is going to be seated over here to sign books. And so if you'll give him a chance to make his way down there, like, don't rush it, okay? No stampedes. But if we'll give him a chance to get down here and settled, you can start lining up over there, and we are dismissed.